Well, friends, the plot thickens with the Maine shooting. It seems that there are some things that simply do not add up. And of course, we're back to the blame game, which is apparently on us. We're the ones to blame in all of this, when in fact there really is somebody else besides the rampage killer who's at fault here. More notably, the federal government and local state government. The federal government failed at every possible turn regarding the National Guard oversight of this killer. They housed him in their mental institution for 2 weeks this past summer in July, and then released him. And then local law enforcement seems to have dropped the ball completely on everything. In fact, local law enforcement right now is kind of running from the media because the blame looks to be placed squarely on their shoulders. The Maine National Guard asked local police to check on this reservist, who was the killer, after a soldier became concerned he would snap and commit a mass shooting. Now, reports are that a group of guys went to the state of New York, a group of guardsmen, I should say, went to the state of New York, and they got out to go get some beer from the hotel. They went to either a parking lot, a supermarket, or something like that. When they got out, the guardsmen were making fun of this future killer, calling him a pedophile. You guys may or may not know, but some information had come out early on when the shooting originally took place that this shooter was a pedophile and a registered sex offender. It turns out that somebody in the state of Maine has the exact same name as this killer did, and he was a registered sex offender. So that confusion was there, thinking that the actual killer was a registered sex offender. So that's where that sounds like this joking and messing with this guy came from, that apparently somebody knew that there was a person with the same name who was a registered sex offender, so they were calling this guy, the incorrect person, a pedophile. And it made him mad. And I understand. I mean, you call me a pedophile, I'd be a little aggravated too, the fact that I'm not one. So I understand where that came from. The thing is, he got a little bit too rattled, because then he started making threats to kill all these guys. Now, the day after all of this went down, where they argued in a parking lot, one of the other guardsmen went to his hotel room and tried to confront him, or at least talk to him about what had happened the night before and the threats he made. In fact, warn him, you need to stop making these open threats to kill people. Somebody's going to take it seriously and you're going to get in trouble. And at that point, the future killer also made additional threats. So this particular guardsman took this killer to a base hospital where a psychologist determined he needed further treatment, which led to a 14-day psychiatric stay, and then he was subsequently released after that. Now, Maine has a yellow flag law that can be used to assess an individual with access to weapons. The first step is for law enforcement to take someone believed to be dangerous into custody and then have them evaluated by a medical professional. After a diagnosis, a judge can approve an order to temporarily remove firearms according to the law. So this would be kind of a quasi due process red flag gun law. It's still removing, taking, confiscating firearms from a person. I don't know how you address that, but at least this particular, and it is a red flag gun law, it's just a different type of one. This yellow flag law that they call it, at least involves taking the person in custody. And I've said this all along, that if a person is truly a threat, why would you take their weapons and leave them out there? I'm not saying I approve of any of these types of laws, but it's absolute stupidity when you've identified a person who is willing to take somebody else's life. And if they say, I want to kill a bunch of people with this pen, I want to kill a room full of people with this ink pen, it's absolutely ignorant for me to go, wait a minute, let me take this ink pen from you and you're good to go now. How stupid is that? That's what these laws are equivalent to. They simply disarm the threat. You have never permanently disarmed a threat as long as the threat is still out in society and has access to every other tool available to anybody else to hurt somebody else. It happens up here. The person decides they want to take a life and then they act on it. It doesn't start with this. This is not what provokes them. Now, believe it or not, CNN started raising questions about what information law enforcement in the state had about threats and the mental health condition of the shooter. But when CNN asked state Public Safety Commissioner, Mike whatever, about it, he replied, "I won't answer." Went on to say, "Based on what I've seen, we're going to continue to work through that." Let me tell you what that's going to lead to. That is going to lead to federal oversight on mental health type checks. The federal government has tried to distance themselves from directly being involved in red flag gun laws because they know they're unconstitutional. That's why in last year's Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, whatever stupid name they had, they earmarked billions of dollars in there to bribe local states into implementing their own unconstitutional red flag gun laws because the federal government knew we can't do it at the federal level because it's simply unconstitutional. It violates the Second Amendment. So they earmarked all this money to try to get the states to be the unconstitutional ones and do it at the state level. Well, now that the state government in Maine has failed miserably as far as checking on this guy, monitoring this guy, whatever warnings they got and acting appropriately on them, watch the federal government to come out and say, see, we need to be in charge now. Because the state of Maine failed on this. They won't say this out loud and openly. They'll say this behind closed doors and try to put more money into future anti-gun bills going forward to say, hey, we can do better than the states. Because they're going to point back to this and say that the state of Maine failed, so we need to take over. So other states don't fail because we're the government and we do everything better, right? Make no mistake, state, local, federal, they all failed on this. But guess who they blame? They blame us and they blame inanimate objects. They literally have the answers right before them on where the failings were. Yet they ignore them all. Why? Because they point right back at themselves. No federal, state, local agencies ever want to blame any other government agencies. And I mean government at the state, local level, or at the federal level. They never want to blame each other because as soon as they do that, they are basically pointing the finger at themselves because they are a government entity themselves. So they never want to lay that blame where it belongs. You will never see these guys openly blame any level of government about this type of stuff. Because again, it puts them in a position of admitting fault and failure at, well, in this case, at every possible level. Now, further example that the gun community does its work and does it properly. Nearly 3 months before Wednesday's shooting, the killer tried to buy a firearm silencer from Coastal Defense Firearms in Auburn, Maine, which is right across the river from Lewiston. But the owner of the store, an FFL, Rick LaChapelle, refused to let the killer complete the purchase after he disclosed on a form that he had mental issues. So once again, we hold ourselves to a higher standard, right? Anything that took place to prevent this, or slow this at least, was done by us. We police ourselves. We make sure that we are not putting guns, or in this case, suppressors, into the hands of dangerous people. Now, that obviously is not going to prevent this particular shooting because, again, it was a suppressor, not a gun. But nevertheless, this gentleman who owns this FFL saw this as a potential threat or a red flag, and I don't mean it as a red flag warning, but as a red flag, a bad thing, a sign that something might not be right, and he prevented that sale. Again, we police ourselves because we're the responsible ones here. Now, quick note that I want to point out, there are different types of stories coming out about how this guy took his own life. One of the reports that I read that is a little suspect to me, and I think I'm going to need some clarification because some of this just doesn't make sense. You'll know that the rifle that this killer used in his rampage, the tool he chose, he made a decision to choose, was a .308 caliber Ruger SFAR rifle. Now, they're saying that this killer shot himself to end his own life. There are reports that he shot himself twice in the head. Now, out of fairness, they claim that back in July, when he purchased the Ruger 308, he also purchased a Beretta, I believe is one of the 92F models. So unless he shot himself with the 92F, which is a 9mm handgun, there's no way this guy shot himself in the head with a 308 and then shot himself again in the head with a 308. First of all, there wouldn't have been anything left. Even if he had slightly shot himself, there would not have been much left. So there's no way, if it comes out that that Ruger was what he used to end his own life, That's not true. This is a lie, and I don't believe anything they tell me from that point forward. Hell, I'm not sure I believe anything right now. But nevertheless, if they come out and say that, you can mark my word. This is a lie, this is a setup, and this is all fabricated and BS. Now, I still have questions if it was the Beretta 92F. How many people would have the wherewithal and the conscious nature and ability to put a round in their dome and then say that wasn't enough and then do it again? If there was a second round that entered this man's dome from his own hand, I question it the entire way through. I don't see it. Is it physically possible with the 92F? Yes. Yes, it is. Is it likely? No.
God save the Queen, man.
I'm sorry, I thought this was America. He's over.